You're sitting in your apartment, city lights all sparkly outside your window, and suddenly, bam! You're hit with this wave of memories, right out of nowhere. That's kinda what happened to V one night, and it led to something, well, something pretty unbelievable actually. It's a story about a dog, a loyal friend from childhood, who maybe, just maybe, came back from beyond. Sounds a little crazy, I know, but stick with me. V was just chilling in her apartment, overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Man, those city lights, they can be pretty mesmerizing, like a scattered handful of diamonds. It was an unusually quiet night for Atlanta, which was weird in itself. And she was just nostalgic. You know that feeling? Like the air itself is whispering old stories in your ear. She'd been in that apartment for years, making a life for herself, climbing the marketing ladder, all that grown-up stuff. But tonight? Tonight, her mind was a time machine, zooming straight back to her childhood. And of course, Cooper popped into her head. Cooper. Not just a dog, but her dog. Her furry shadow, her confidant, the guy who knew all her secrets even if he couldn't understand a word she said. It had been ages since she'd seen him. Seriously, years. Since she was 18 and bolted from her small hometown just outside Atlanta, ready to conquer the world, or at least the marketing world. Growing up in that little town, Cooper had been her constant. 12 years old when he came into her life, a goofy, clumsy golden retriever puppy. He was her shadow through awkward teenage years, first crushes, the general drama of high school. But then life as it does happened. City life called, work got crazy demanding, and somehow, she drifted away from that part of her life, the small town life, the Cooper life. She remembered the phone call from her parents, a few years back, telling her Cooper had passed. Peaceful, they said. Old age, under his favorite oak tree in their backyard. V had cried, of course. Felt that familiar pang of guilt for not being there, for being so caught up in her own world. But what could she do? Life moved on, right? That's what everyone says. But tonight was different. There was this weird warmth hanging in the air, almost comforting. It was like being wrapped in a familiar blanket. It reminded her of those nights as a kid, falling asleep with Cooper sprawled out next to her bed. Remember that feeling? His soft fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing, like a gentle lullaby. She closed her eyes for a second, almost feeling that warmth again. And then she heard it. A faint scratching at her apartment door. Scratch, scratch. So subtle, she almost dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks. Maybe the building settling? But then it came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Definitely the door. Her heart started doing this weird drum solo in her chest. Okay, deep breaths, V. Who could be scratching at her door at this hour? Wrong apartment? Maybe someone drunk? Or could it be? Nah, don't be ridiculous. She stood up slowly, legs feeling a little shaky, and crept towards the door. Each step felt like it was echoing in the sudden silence of her apartment. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling just a tiny bit. Okay, here we go. She swung the door open, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, in the dimly lit hallway, looking up at her with those so familiar soulful brown eyes. It was Cooper. No mistaking it. He was older, definitely. His once golden fur was streaked with gray, especially around his muzzle. But those eyes, those were Cooper's eyes. Cooper, she whispered, almost afraid to breathe, like he might vanish if she spoke too loud. Tears instantly welled up, blurring her vision. She knelt down, hands shaking as she reached out. Could this be real? Was she dreaming? Her fingers brushed his fur. Soft, warm, real. It was like no time had passed at all. Cooper, is it really you? She choked out, tears now streaming down her face. The dog, Cooper, wagged his tail, slow and gentle, and took a step forward, nudging his wet nose into her hand. Oh my God, it was him. V's heart was doing acrobatics. Disbelief, pure joy, utter confusion, all jumbled together. He shouldn't be here. She knew that. Logically. Scientifically, impossibly, he shouldn't be here. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that he was here. Nah. With her. Come on in, boy, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. She gently guided him inside, closing the door behind them, almost like she was afraid someone would see him and tell her she was crazy. Cooper, bless his old soul, didn't seem fazed at all. He just trotted straight towards her bedroom, like he knew exactly where he was going. Just like he used to do when he was a pup. He hopped onto her bed, a little slower and more deliberately than he used to, she noticed, and settled down, curling up right in his old spot, next to her pillow. V followed him, just watching him, still in a daze. Memories flooded back, a tidal wave of them. Nights crying into his fur after a bad day at school, feeling utterly alone and knowing Cooper was the only one who truly got it. He'd been her rock through everything. And now, here he was again. But how? Her brain was starting to catch up with the emotion. Cooper had passed away. She knew that. So, how could he be here, sniffing her pillow and settling in for the night? The more she thought, the more her head spun. But then, this strange sense of peace washed over her. Maybe this wasn't something she was supposed to understand. Maybe it was just a gift. One last night with her best friend. She lay down beside him, just like old times, her hand resting on his back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. It felt like home. For the first time in ages, she felt safe. Like everything was going to be okay, even if she couldn't explain how or why. The worries of the day, the stress of her career, the general chaos of adulting. It all just melted away. As they lay there, V thought about everything Cooper had taught her, even in his absence. Loyalty. Unconditional love. He'd been there for her during some of the toughest times, and even though he hadn't been physically present for years, those lessons, that deep-down feeling of being loved and understood, had stayed with her. She drifted off to sleep, completely and utterly comforted by Cooper's presence. That night, she dreamed of them as kids again, running through fields, playing fetch until they were both panting, the pure, simple joy of just being together. The years melted away, and they were both young, carefree, and full of life. Sunlight streamed through her window, waking her up slowly. She stretched out her hand, instinctively expecting to feel Cooper's warm fur beside her. But the bed was empty. Her heart did a little skip beat of panic as she sat up, quickly looking around the room. Gone. Cooper was gone. A pang of sadness hit her, sharp and sudden. But it was mixed with something else. A quiet understanding. She knew deep down that this was how it was meant to be. He'd come back, just for one night. To remind her of their bond, of the strength she carried within her because of him. Getting out of bed, starting her day, everything felt different. Lighter. More peaceful. The usual weight of the world, the constant pressure of her job, it all seemed a little less heavy. Cooper's visit, even just for that fleeting night, had reminded her of the really important stuff. Love. Loyalty. Living in the moment. Over the next few weeks, V found herself slowing down a bit. Taking more time for herself. Actually stepping away from the 24/7 hustle of her marketing job. She even reached out to some old friends from her hometown, people she hadn't talked to in ages, and reconnected with her family more. And every now and then, she'd just pause, close her eyes, and remember the warmth of Cooper's fur, the sound of his breathing, that feeling of unconditional love. It hit her then. Cooper's return wasn't just about comfort. It was a nudge. A reminder of the things she'd kind of forgotten in the fast-paced city life. She'd lost sight of what truly mattered. Cooper had come back to show her that love, connection, those were the things that gave life real meaning. She ended up telling her best friend, Sarah, about the whole thing. So get this, V started a little nervously, knowing how crazy it sounded. Cooper. He came back. Sarah, bless her, just raised an eyebrow and said, Cooper? Your dog? Didn't he? V nodded, bracing herself for the skepticism. Yeah, he did. But he was at my door. Just there. At first, Sarah was totally skeptical. Naturally. V, are you sure you weren't just dreaming? Maybe you were really tired, but as V kept talking, describing Cooper's graying fur, the way he'd gone straight to her bed, the whole night, Sarah's eyes softened. She started to get it. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about something bigger. Wow, Sarah said finally, shaking her head slightly. That's actually really beautiful, V. She understood. It wasn't about logic or explanation. It was about love, transcending time and space, the power of memories that stay with you long after someone, or some dog, is gone. V smiled, remembering the last thing she'd whispered to Cooper before falling asleep that night. "Thank you for always being there for me." In the end, she couldn't explain it, not really. Didn't need to. What mattered was the love, the bond, and how it continued to shape her life, years later. And as Vi walked through the busy streets of Atlanta, her heart felt full. She knew Cooper would always be with her, in a way guiding her, reminding her of what truly mattered. The people and yes, the animals we love, the connections we make, the memories that last a lifetime. That was Cooper's gift. A reminder that love, it never really dies. It just stays with you. But there was still this nagging feeling though. Cooper's visit, it felt like more than just comfort. Like there was a deeper purpose, something she hadn't quite grasped yet. The bond they shared, it was still so present, almost like he was watching over her, guiding her. Even in his absence. It was a comforting thought, mixed with a little bit of curiosity. Weeks turned into months. Work was still demanding, but Vi started making conscious choices. Time for herself. Time for things she'd neglected for too long. She started taking walks in the park near her apartment, reconnecting with nature, finding joy in the small things again. And she started volunteering at the local animal shelter. The shelter was bittersweet. She loved being around the dogs, showering them with attention, but there was always a pang of sadness for the ones who'd been abandoned, mistreated. But volunteering felt right. It felt like Cooper would have wanted her to be there. One evening, heading to the shelter for her weekly shift, she felt this weird tug at her heart. Like something was pulling her in a certain direction. The familiar sounds of barking and paws scratching against cages filled the air as she walked in. She greeted the staff and headed towards the back, where the older dogs were kept. Those were her favorites. She had a soft spot for the senior pups, the ones often overlooked for the energetic puppies. Like Cooper in his later years, still full of love, just a little slower. As she walked past the kennels, something caught her eye. In the last cage on the left, curled up in a small ball, was a golden retriever. Fur streaked with gray. Just like Cooper had been in his final years. The dog lifted his head, and their eyes met. Vi's heart skipped a beat. Something about this dog. It was familiar. She walked closer, kneeling down by the cage. Reaching out her hand slowly, cautiously. The dog, also slowly, lifted his head, sniffed her hand, then rested his chin right in her palm. Vi gasped softly. A wave of recognition? Connection? It was like Cooper's spirit was right there, looking at her through these old kind eyes. "What's his name?" Vi asked one of the shelter workers who'd come over. "That's Chance," the worker replied. "He's been here for a while now. Older dogs, you know. People usually want puppies." Vi nodded, her heart aching for Chance. It wasn't just coincidence. This connection, it was too strong, too real. It felt like Cooper had led her here. To this moment. To this dog. That night, after her shift, Chance was all she could think about. The way he'd looked at her. The way he'd rested his head in her hand. It was so Cooper. Lying in bed, memories of all those nights with Cooper flooded back. Comforting her. Protecting her. Maybe it was her turn to do the same for Chance. The next morning, Vi knew what she had to do. She went back to the shelter. And she adopted Chance. Bringing him home felt right. As they walked into her apartment, Chance hesitated for a second, sniffing the air, looking around, getting his bearings. And then, just like Cooper, all those years ago, he walked straight to her bedroom. And curled up on the bed. Vi smiled, tears welling up again, but this time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Watching him settle in, it felt like he'd always belonged there. Just like Cooper had. Over the next few weeks, Vi and Chance, they just clicked. Developed a bond that was so familiar, so reminiscent of Cooper. Chance wasn't a replacement, of course. No dog could ever replace Cooper. But he filled a void she hadn't even realized was still there. He was gentle, loyal, and he just understood her. In a way that only dogs can. One evening, sitting on the couch, Chance's head resting on her lap, Vi thought back to that night Cooper had come to her. She still couldn't explain it. Dream. Vision. Something else entirely? Didn't matter. It had changed her. Reminded her of the important stuff. Love. Loyalty. Connection. Chance was a new chapter, yes. But he was also a continuation of Cooper's lessons. A reminder that love never really fades. It lives on in the connections we make, the lives we touch. And in that moment, with Chance beside her, V felt a deep, profound sense of peace. Months passed. Life moved on. V kept reflecting on everything. Cooper's visit, it had set something in motion, something she couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply. It had reignited her passion for living a life with purpose, with compassion, with connection. And with Chance by her side, she knew those lessons, Cooper's lessons, would continue to guide her. One day, walking with Chance in the park, she saw a young girl sitting alone on a bench, head hung low. Sad. The girl looked up as they approached, and V saw the tears in her eyes. Without even being asked, Chance walked right up to the girl and rested his head on her lap. Just like he did with V when she was feeling down. The girl smiled, a small watery smile, and started gently stroking Chance's fur. V sat down beside her. "That's Chance," she said softly. "He seems to have a way of knowing when people need a little comfort." The girl nodded, tears welling up again. "I miss my dog," she whispered. "He passed away a few months ago, and I feel so lost without him." V's heart ached for her. She knew that feeling all too well. "I understand," she said gently. "I lost my dog a few years ago too. His name was Cooper. He meant the world to me." The girl looked up, curiosity replacing some of the sadness. "How did you get through it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. V smiled softly, looking down at Chance, still happily accepting pets from the girl. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But I realized, the love we share with our dogs, it never really goes away. It stays with us, in our hearts, in our memories. And sometimes," she added, a little catch in her voice, "if we're lucky, life gives us a chance to love again." The girl smiled, wiping away a tear. "Thank you," she whispered, still stroking Chance's fur. As V and Chance continued their walk through the park, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Cooper had come back to her for one night, to remind her of their love, to guide her towards this new beginning with Chance. And now that love was spreading, touching the life of a girl who needed it, just like she had needed Cooper all those years ago. Cooper's visit, it was more than just a reunion. It was a gift. A reminder that love never truly dies. It lives on. In the bonds we create, the lives we touch, the memories we carry. And as she walked, hand in hand, well, hand in paw with Chance, V knew that Cooper would always be with her, guiding her, reminding her that love, loyalty and kindness, those were the greatest gifts of all.